First of all, I want to thank you all for coming. Wow. This is really a nice turnout. Just to start things off, for those of you who are familiar with Imago, we are a 501c3 organization that a group of member artists who not only run the gallery but do various kinds of educational, artistic outreach like poetry and video and music and all kinds of things. So one of the things I would encourage you to do is to look at our website, get on the mailing list, because there's a lot happening here that's really cool. The other thing, just as a formality, if you're not familiar with the premises, obviously the front door is an exit. There's an exit in the far corner over there that takes you out into the back, and basically that should work. The restroom over there is technically not an exit, but I don't know if you could open up the window. You just go to where the back door is anyway, so that doesn't matter. What I would like to do is to just kind of set the stage of what we'll be doing. I'm going to talk for a short period of time to explain some stuff about my art. And then I'm going to ask Vivian Iyer, who's our one friend, our great poet at Imago, who's done a lot to bring poetry events to our organization. And since Vivian came to and joined us, joined our great community, she and I have had all kinds of conversations over the years that I found really, really good. So she's not necessarily here as a poet, more as somebody who's really been a fun person to talk to about art, and she might give her impressions, engage with me in a dialogue, ask questions, and hopefully spur you to ask questions as well. So I will begin. Having said that, the purpose of the talk really is to not tell you how I do these, but rather to kind of explain the journey that I've gone through. Because essentially, while I am a photographer and go around with camera taking pictures like lots of other photographers, especially for the last 7 or so years, I've been doing digital compositions. And I've been on this little journey as the compositions have changed over the years. So what I thought I would do was really, and what's actually more interesting to me, is to kind of think about the journey that I've been on and the kind of artistic considerations that I've had to make given the medium that I've chosen to work in, rather than to go through exactly how they're made, because that's probably not going to interest too many people here unless you're some kind of Photoshop addict or something like that. What I do want to do, I will show a video that's 1:28 seconds that will give you an idea of how they do go together, and maybe that might spur some questions, but I'd rather really focus on the art per se. You know, to me the technology is interesting, and obviously I'm very engaged in it, but that's not really the end as far as I'm concerned. My real concern and what I want to try to give you hopefully some insights into is what you see up on the wall, and particularly why I do what I do. I do have a little bit of an ulterior motive to this, which will become apparent as the evening goes on, because I actually am, as you will see, constantly tweaking and changing what I do. And so I'm always kind of interested in, as I'm doing something, of, okay, where does it go from here? What kinds of new things could I explore? And I use people as a mirror and conversations like I've had with Vivian and with other members of the Imago art community to kind of help me develop that. I don't want to dwell a whole lot on my history of photography. I basically started thinking about photography kind of seriously in the mid-60s. About 1966, I was in graduate school. I was starting to think about, or actually concretely planning to go to Iran to do field research for my dissertation. And one of my mentors said, you know, you really ought to get a good camera. You don't know what you're going to see, and you may never go back. Who knows? Yeah, okay, I'll get a camera. So I got a camera, and being me, I kind of approach a lot of things technically. So I wasn't just going to pick up a camera and load it with film and walk around. I was going to really learn what all the it was a good camera. So I was going to learn what the settings were, why I would use one lens versus another lens, that kind of consideration. So back in the 60s, I started reading photo magazines. At the time, they were not only dedicated to teaching you in these various articles about the hardware, but if you think about it, it was kind of in the late 50s and going into the 60s, clearly by the mid 60s, that people were beginning to think about photography as an art. You know, it was one of these things that prior to that was not artistic. But, you know, MoMA already had a curator of photography for a number of years, but really started rolling in the post-World War II period. And there was just a lot of discussion about art. Even some of the classical photographers of the time were either still alive or had just died, and people were really starting to look at their work, in addition to people like Diane Arbus and some of the other people who were already kind of moving in different circles to kind of create that idea that photography was an art. So the technical approach to photography, but being exposed to the classical photographers, was a part of one of the precursors of the journey that I've been on. The other thing was just the beginnings of that I count as kind of a major point in what you see up here on the walls, is when I became really interested in digital compositions, and that was I could date it, it was 2012. I already actually had an interest in some of the people who did compositions, people like Jerry Yulesman, for example. But back in the olden days, when people had film, you know, you would do a negative sandwich or play around with successive exposures and try to guess what it was going to look like when you finally developed the film. But from that, we were on a trip to Venice in 2012, a city that I dearly love. And there was an exhibit at the Palazzo Fortuny of several different artists, none of whom I recognized at that point. But that was really significant because that was my introduction to Beatrice Helg. And here's some examples of her work. Hopefully you could kind of see them. You know, if you're slightly off the axis, the colors may not be accurate. But in the Fortuny Museum, there were 2 floors, actually 2 plus 4 floors, because there's a little garret, of these very large works by Beatrice Helg. I had never heard about her before, but you know, I was just transfixed. And I looked at these, and I just remember kind of walking through and finding places where, like, if you know, one of the attendants wasn't sitting, so I could sit down and just kind of look at a wall and look at a wall and look at a wall. And I was just, you know, there was something really magical about it. And I said to myself, you want to know something? I really want to figure out how to do something like that. I had no idea what I was talking about, but this became kind of, I work a lot by stimulation. I see something, it stimulates something, it might be an idea, it might be from an element of something, but her work was just like totally mind-blowing. One of the things that she sort of, I know that she does some kind of like large-scale, almost studio setups or almost theatrical setups with shapes and lights and things like that. But clearly, if you look at her work, she's also playing around with the, in post-processing in something like Photoshop, probably Photoshop. But that inspired me to really start digging. So the result of that was early works like this, which actually the two on the left, the one on the left and the one in the upper center, were my first exhibit here at a community exhibit back in 2013 when I first started creating these. And these were kind of real motivations to try to, I mean, obviously you don't imitate somebody and you don't want to be an exact copy unless you're a forger. But you know, it was just the idea of kind of playing with the effects and with those kind of feelings that were elicited when I first saw Beatrice Held's work. And so the upper ones are more kind of in the nature of how I translated what she was doing to techniques that I was familiar with, starting out with a photo of mine, and then using elements from that to create these effects. It's harder than you think because, I don't know, there's something, you can't just take any photo and immediately start doing it. It doesn't work. So sometimes, you know, you just have to see something and you look at it and you say, oh, you know, I see something there. I have a lot of them in my computer archives that just don't work, or that you know, I looked at it and I went, you know, they don't really. And so there's a certain kind of limitation in totally working with what the kind of work that Beatrice Held does. So, but I kept playing with compositions. So in the lower panel, you see something that's actually a composition that is based on 4.5 different photos that I put together just to kind of also sort of, you know, it was just an idea. Where do I go from here? What can I make work? Oh, okay, let me try this. And so this was a part of the experimentation I did. So from there, I was kind of basically, for people who remember what I was doing way back prior to late 2017, you know, basically I was exhibiting either straight photography, the kind of photos that you could, you know, do a little traditional darkroom kind of manipulations, except doing it in Photoshop rather than with chemicals, or some compositions, the kind of things that I showed you. But then I hit this inflection point that I date as kind of the beginning of this journey that I want to describe to you. Because in 2017, we were in Paris, and we were, you know, walking around. I'm walking around with a camera, obviously, and you know, I came upon something, and you know, there was a reflection in a mirror, and I said, "Oh, that's interesting." I took a picture, and then I was kind of walking around, and I said, you know, maybe I'll have a little focus. You know, we're going to be walking around a lot. We were going to be in Paris for 2 weeks, and so I said, well, I'll give myself a little focus. I'll start looking for opportunities to play with reflections. So I kind of consider the first real step of the journey that I'm on right now based on this idea of creating things with reflections. And I did some things like this. The one on the left is pretty much of a straight photo that plays with an abstraction by kind of manipulating where I was standing in relation to the mirrors that were there. This is in the lower level of the Louis Vuitton Foundation in the Bois de Boulogne in Frank Gehry building. We went there basically to see the Frank Gehry building, but there's this incredible installation by the Icelandic Danish multimedia artist. I'm trying to think of a good word for him. Olafur Eliasson. And so, you know, I started looking because there were, with these yellow panels, aluminum yellow panels, there were also faces with mirrors on them, and I'm going, mirrors. So I created that. I created that extraction in the middle. And then, and these were all obviously when I got home. They're not things that you could do in the camera. You know, then I began to think, oh, well, okay, well, what else do I have? And began to, you know, I had several other photos and things like that, and realized, well, gee, you know, I could take something, and the one on the right is actually playing with the same idea with reflections, but the secret is that it's actually a digital composition. It's not a straight photo. It's actually a product of, again, 4+ photos. And actually most people, Ed's sitting in the room, Ed Macklin, who's the guest artist here for this exhibit. I encourage you to see his sculptures. Was one of the only people that I ever recall seeing that picture and saying, you know, is that what I think it is? I'm going, yeah, I think we're on the same wavelength. But you know, the problem with reflections that I began to realize, especially that, you know, when I started like searching for things to, you know, how to make compositions out of it, was, you know, kind of like what I was doing with the Beatrice Helg limitation, that you needed something with a mirror. And so I began to think, okay, well, if I don't have mirrors, how do I keep playing with these reflections? Well, you know, you could create reflective kinds of things in Photoshop, and there's all kinds of tutorials and stuff on doing that. And but I sort of began thinking, well, you know, kind of maybe, and this is also maybe thinking a little bit about Beatrice Helg, you know, maybe I'll just try to set up something. And I was, you know, trying, my mind starts running, and suddenly I said to myself, it's probably because I was looking at a shelf in my workspace on which I have lots of kaleidoscopes, and I said, aha, kaleidoscopes have mirrors in it. Why don't I start thinking of something like that? And so it was kind of, then it became a little bit of a challenge, to tell you the truth. Here are some of the things that I created with kaleidoscopes, or kind of with this kaleidoscopic technique. Now, I brought a prop. Here's, I can pass this around. Here's an element of the one you see on the left. And the reason why there's that object that you're passing around is because when I first encountered Photoshop, I kind of like, okay, how do I create a triangle? And I sort of imagined it as if I was sitting at a drafting board doing geometric constructions with drafting, you know, straight edge and a compass and some triangles. You could do a lot of stuff. And so I kind of approached it that way. Well, the secret is that, you know, Photoshop is not a CAD program, so you can't do exceedingly precise triangles. And the first time I was playing with the triangle that you're looking at while passing around, as I was connecting them together to make kaleidoscope shapes, I realized that it's not exactly an equilateral triangle, and so I couldn't do it. But I had invested so much time in the process at that point that I just I have my work printed at IO Labs. I just sent the triangle to IO Lab. I said, you know, like, print 30 of these for me. And then I had them mounted on rigid board and then put on those little triangular pieces. And I ended up, I just said, well, I'll salvage something. So I actually used, I had a few extra pieces, one of which is what you're passing around. But I used that to just create sort of a quasi-kaleidoscope. I mean, I was desperate to salvage some of the time I put in. In the meantime, I actually started learning that there's a tool in Photoshop that makes equilateral triangles pretty easy. It's just a question of size, and I finally stumbled across it. They used to hide stuff, and sometimes it's just like, oh, I didn't realize that was there. But anyways, I actually started doing kaleidoscopes. Excuse me. So the first one that was really successful that's been exhibited at Imago is the one you see in the middle. And I did several from there. And basically, I ran into this other kind of little bit of a hesitation point. When you think about it, a kaleidoscope is just, because of the mirrors, you're looking at these equilateral triangles that keep reflecting. So if you want to create something like a kaleidoscopic effect, basically you're restricted to an equilateral triangle that you then start matching the edges until you have a regular hexagon, in other words, a hexagon with equal sides, and then you just multiply that. And so after doing a few of the kaleidoscopes like that, I was kind of like, you know, it's starting to get a little boring. How do I make it different? So I started playing, one with the idea of doing some circles, because, you know, most of the time when you look through a kaleidoscope, you're looking at through a little circular eyepiece. And so I started playing with circles as a way of doing a variation, and then I started doing things like creating these things with border effects, and, you know, just to kind of search for a way of not being boring to people. I kind of hate being boring. But while I was doing these kaleidoscopes, another kind of little crazy happenstance, Susan and I went up to the MFA. I can't remember specifically why we went up to see an exhibit, but, you know, you get up there, you've paid all that money for parking and everything to get in, and so you start looking at other things in the museum, one of which happened to be a retrospective of M.C. Escher, who we all know was a Dutch printmaker and was very well known for playing with optical illusions and kaleidoscope effects. And I said, you know, I mean, we wouldn't have gone to the MFA to see Escher, because you see so much of his work all over in books and things about perspective and whatever. But it was fun looking at the exhibit. And in the exhibit, I came across one of the work that I had never seen before, which is called Circle Limit 3. And I looked at that and I went, wow, somebody else was playing with these kaleidoscopic things before me. Maybe I'm not as insane as I think I am. And so it really fascinated me. And of course, you know, in the museum shop, I bought the postcard because it was really cool. You know, I come home, I put the postcard on my desk, I'm playing with kaleidoscopes, and there's Escher's print staring at me, small scale, obviously. And one day I looked at it and I said, you know, it's not exactly a kaleidoscope. There's something going on there. And you could kind of begin to get an idea of it. And that started this journey. I was determined to make something that looked, you know, that kind of created some of these effects that Escher has in his pieces. This is of the four that are particularly called circle limits. This is the one that I keep relying on because, as you'll find out in a minute, but there's a lot going on there, and it's really not apparent to the eye. So, you know, being me, I kind of started exploring other avenues. I was still playing with triangles, but, you know, I started coming up with kind of different ways of doing triangles. So the geometry of these is actually kind of simple, and you could kind of see from the first one, it's just a question of changing the dimensions of a triangle within a circumscribed circle, and then using a triangular section of a photo to create the effect. And I did the first one I did because it only has one ray of light in it. This is from it was one of these situations we were in Amsterdam, and I took some photos. It's like, wow, these are really cool patterns of light being transmitted. Had no idea what I was going to do with them. But I played with that, finally, like, oh, I know what I could do. Simple photo, one ray of light. Then, so when that one worked, I tried it, the middle one, fission, is actually two rays of light and some dispersion of the light that was being projected through this room, because they used sort of a haze effect from, I think it was like CO2 that created a little bit of fog, so there was some dispersion of light. So I did that one, and I was going, oh, you know, okay, you know, you could do things. And then I tried the other one, which has like, I can't tell you how many rays of light, and really presented a challenge technically to kind of do masking. But, you know, the nice thing in the progression of what I'm explaining is that I kept kind of playing with techniques, and I kept sort of learning how to use the technique that I've been using a little bit better, a little more efficiently, a little in maybe slightly different formats to create some variety in what I was doing. And basically, at that point, I was like, oh, okay, I've already playing and doing a lot of stuff with circles. Thank you. IO Labs cuts all my stuff to shape. They've never blinked an eyelash at any shape I've asked them to do. But one of the ideas I had is, well, you know, if you're doing kaleidoscopes with triangles, I can make fans. And, you know, with this kind of, as you know, Susan and I are involved in the Japanese culture and the Japanese aesthetic. So I thought of fans, and I started playing with the idea of fans. The one on the left is the first fan I ever tried, but underlying it is an equilateral triangle and only two iterations. So there's one concentric band and then a second concentric band, but they're basically, it's all triangles. You can't tell by looking at the finished piece because I make a lot of effort to hide the edges. Anyways, there are triangles there. Well, then I kind of played a little bit more and started kind of doing something like the piece in the center, where I played a little bit more with the triangles, and then I kind of moved, and one day I said, you know, it really is a challenge to take an equilateral triangular section out of a photo. What if I tried to play around with a full frame photo? And the one on the right is actually the first time I ever tried using a full frame photo to create a fan. And also I began in that one to go from 2 layers to 3 layers. Then I began to say, well, you know, if I do that, you could really create a lot of different shapes. I was already playing with fans. I was already playing with circles. So then I started thinking about polygons. You know, once you start playing, especially with a full frame photo, it's really easy to start translating that into various kinds of polygons. And those basically started evolving little by little. So I also started thinking about kind of the formats. In particular, one of the things is what do you have with a repetitive pattern? One of the first things you think about is mandalas. So I started kind of playing with the idea of mandalas. The one on the left, upper left of this case, photo that I took while we were in Iran in 2018, it really extends to many, many more layers or many more concentric rings or concentric bands, the use of the polygons. And I also, in that one, began to start playing a little bit with varying the size or the height of the band. Because I began to say to myself, gee, you know, if I do that, maybe I could create some interesting effects with it. I also started playing like the one in the middle, the Lotus Mandala, with the idea of trying to do things like not necessarily match edges. And that's the only one I did from that, because what you do with that is you kind of end up, since you can't match the edge exactly, it would look kind of stupid unless you had a like really crazy pattern, like maybe the one up on the panel there. But you know what Escher did as a painter is he did these bands that, you know, when I first looked at him, I kind of said, oh, he's not matching edges, he's kind of cheating a little bit. But I created these bands, but the bands were sort of boring, so I ended up filling them with lotuses, the flower that was also in the photograph. And then I started playing with other kind of techniques to create perspective effects, just to kind of keep playing with patterns, to just keep challenging myself, either with new techniques or with new patterns or things like that, also in an attempt to keep exhibiting and be interesting. You know, I even went so far as to do a piece, it's actually never been printed, but one of these days I will. The one on the left, that's actually, it's a composite photo. I created a composite from two different photos and then did the construction itself. But I also started playing with the idea, you know, if you're doing polygons, a square is a polygon, you know, there's all kinds of possibilities. And even going so far in the one on the right of taking a full frame section of a photo, but then sort of free-forming these spirals within it, creating effects and things like that. Well, you know, up to that point, I was, you know, still basically in the two-dimensional world. You know, constructions that you could easily imagine being pieced together on a flat plane. And basically, you know, not Euclidean geometry. Euclidean is kind of a fancy name for plane geometry. It's the basic two-dimensional XY axis that we're all familiar with, you know, from having had to study geometry, which I actually liked, as you could probably tell. But that started kind of moving me in the back of my mind to always kind of thinking about this situation with Escher. And periodically when I would have a minute, or I would have, I don't know, a flash of insight, or what I thought was insight, some idea, what I would do is I would go on the web and I would start searching for stuff about Escher and the circle limits, and little by little I started getting hits that started leading me in. One that started telling me, oh, well, one is spherical geometry. It's not two-dimensional geometry. It's Euclidean, non-Euclidean, or three-dimensional geometry. So basically, it's the idea of adding a z-axis to create a 3D world and then representing it on a 2D surface. So I started getting hints of that, and I finally ran across a paper that explained the underlying math, because you can't freeform this stuff. But it began to help me understand what the math that was involved. And so that's the point that we get to the things that you see on the wall. I've started to be able to move away from this two-dimensional world that we're kind of used to seeing with most of our visual art, except for people like Ed, obviously. But into this representation of these 3D spherical, more complex geometries into what I do. So again, there is the Escher. Now, it sounds really scary. It's actually kind of simple to visualize if you think about it as starting out from a sphere. And so spherical geometry is really based on the idea that if you take a sphere, the simplest way of approaching it is to create what we call great circles. And a great circle is just taking a sphere and slicing it so that the slice goes through the exact center point of the sphere. And on the surface, you would see the consequence of that would be a circle, and that's what we call a great circle. Well, if you could rotate that sphere so that the axis, that center point, is always the same, then you could keep drawing great circles and great circles and great circles. And so what you see as a consequence of that is the beginning of spherical triangles. And spherical triangles are these shapes that look like that, or look like that, that have three sides, but the sides aren't straight. They could either be bowed out as they are here, or they could be bowed in, but that's a different concern of ours right now. But basically, you could start creating this, these sets of patterns and very complex patterns with an approach something like this. Well, that's not exactly what Escher did. Escher had another slight variation on that that really started out, I thought he was more like a 17th century, maybe, or I should say 18th century mathematician, but he was actually, it turned out, he was a 19th century mathematician. He actually died in 1912 by the name of Henri Poincaré. And he did, one of the things that he played with was something which has come to be called a Poincaré disk. And it's essentially a way of overlapping circles. So you have an outer circle, and then you create other circles which intersect the outer circle in a very specific way. If you're really technically rigid about it, the intersection should be 90-degree angles. But if you start creating these arrays of these circles that are positioned according to the underlying mathematics of that were developed by other mathematicians playing on Poincaré, you begin to develop a shape. So if you look at this, the line drawing, you see a lot of Escher in that, and it was like, oh, okay. Now I kind of can visualize the geometry. Plus, I found the paper that starts explaining how you could create the proportions of the overlapping circles in a way that actually starts to build this geometry. So from there, I had to create templates. You can't freeform it. It gets really kind of complex. Unfortunately, it's also really kind of tricky to do in Photoshop because Photoshop isn't a CAD program. But in any event, I've created templates. The first one was pretty crude. It had a lot of fudge factors in it. The second one was a little better, but it had some tricky challenges to it. This is the one that most of these pieces have used. This is the third one and the one I'm currently using. But you could get an idea of basically I have these shapes on my Photoshop workspace. And from that, I'm back to triangles. I take a triangular section of a photo, except one of the things I discovered is they don't have to be equilateral triangles. So now I could kind of really play with it. I sit there with the triangle tool and I kind of like, oh, you know, what's going to look good? So it doesn't matter how obtuse or how acute the angles are or things like that. I have a lot of ability to kind of play around to do that. So now what I want to do is, here's this little video. It's a minute and 28 seconds, but it'll give you an idea, hopefully if it comes up. So that's how they're done. Let's see if I can get to the next one. So the question is, yeah, if you keep doing that, if you look back at Escher, you know, like I keep saying, I've repeated a number of times, my mind keeps going into where does it go from here? What do I do next? I really hate to do the same thing over and over and over again, either not to bore me or not to bore anybody else. But if you look at Escher, one of the possibilities with Escher is Escher does something very subtle in this one. He plays with a changing of the palette. So as a painter, he could make these objects any way he wants, and he plays with that. So I kind of like, well, okay, how do I do that in some way? And these haven't been printed, but these are all brand new since all of these got printed and ready to put on a wall. But it kind of shows you what I started playing with. We were in Barcelona in the spring, and there was in the MoCo, the Contemporary Art Museum, there was an installation. It was a mirrored room, all the walls, floor, ceiling, with these lights that kept changing color patterns. And I walked to it, and you know, my first response is, oh, I bet you a photo of that, you know, could work in one of these limits constructions. And then I started watching the changing of the lights. And I said, if I stand really still and take successive pictures of the different light patterns, maybe I could get them close enough that I could actually match them up so that they, and then, so what I did is I just overlaid some number. I played around, actually the one color one was one of the last ones I did, because I said, I've been playing with this. I did one with 2 different colors. I did one with 3 colors, which I don't show here. I did one with 5 colors. And then I finally said, oh, you know, it'd be interesting to see what they look like with 1 color. And so I chose one of the panels. But basically what I did is I just matched the photos as best I can. When I took a triangular section, it was exactly identical for each of the different color patterns that I used. And then I would just like, okay, what looks good as I was doing the construction. And it was a little bit like a, you know, a map issue, you know, how many colors do you want adjacent, what looks good next to each other and stuff like that. So that was one of the possibilities that I was thinking about. But, you know, the reality is at this point, I'm kind of like, okay, where do I go from here? So we get to the end of the line where we are today. You know, and we could kind of think more specifically about what's on the wall. But basically, I'm kind of sort of thinking of different possibilities that I've just begun to really think about, but none of them have really come out. I mean, I might play a little more with the idea of like the multicolors, even maybe playing with some things like color overlays of the same thing to create my own palette in it. Some other possibilities, you know, I was sitting there one day and I kind of suddenly said, you know, spherical triangle is a polygon. There must be spherical polygons. Sure enough, there are. So I did a quick bit of research on spherical polygons, but I haven't tried any templates from that. The other thing I've been thinking of playing with is seeing if I could take what I've done in Photoshop, create like a 3D wireframe from it, and then kind of manipulate it as a real 3D object, because now there's a lot of 3D photography, not photography, but 3D software tools that are out there that you could use for drawing and various kinds of manipulation. So that might be another direction. But basically, sum everything up as I try to do. Basically, with this particular phase of what I've been doing, I'm kind of thinking that I kind of started out with this struggle to understand the limits. I moved to being able to really explore and kind of perfect what I was doing, and now I'm kind of like, okay, I'm starting to expand it, and hopefully I'll go someplace interesting from there. So that's what I have to say. Why don't we put on the lights, just kind of furniture and invite Vivian to come up and join us.
Sure.
And is your microphone on?
I'm going to do that right now, with any luck.
Hopefully you'll be able to hear us.
I should be on now, Howard.
Yeah, it should be.
Am I? Yeah.
If the light's steady, you're on.
Yeah, I'm on. Okay. So, in the interest of full disclosure, I had to go to summer school for geometry. And so, Howard is in the Brainiac Club, so you see where this is heading. I'm sure the audience has questions, so I'll just start us off with a couple. You know, how much would you say intuition is involved versus mathematical concepts?
That's a good question. Obviously, people always say that while they're trying to think of a coherent answer. It's really a combination. One of the things that you probably heard me repeating a lot of times was, you know, this stopping and thinking, getting an idea, trying to, or seeing something, a piece of art or something like I did with Beatrice Helg or with Escher, and, you know, suddenly it spurs, it's that stimulus, it spurs an idea. And so there is a certain amount of intuition in this, because I don't necessarily know what I'm going to start out with as a photograph. Believe me, some of them work in these patterns, some don't work at all. And so that's been kind of a trial and error process to begin to learn what kinds of things make interesting patterns that I want to see or that other people might want to see. And also to kind of learn, you know, a little bit about how to manipulate them to make it more effective. Like I said, you know, now that I'm not restricted to using just the equilateral triangle, I spend a lot of time kind of playing with exactly what section of the photograph I'm going to take. Because I still need to start out with a triangle. And, you know, there's, you know, imagine a rectangle, which is the photo frame, and then just playing with, you know, pins in a string or something like that, and just think about all the different ways that you could cut a little triangle out of that. So there's a certain amount of playing with that, and you know, back when I was playing with the fans, back when I was playing especially with the polygons, I also began to, you know, like I said, to play with, you know, varying the height of a band or something. And it was always, well, if I did that, what could it come out like? And I think experimentation, there's a certain kind of intuition in that. So it's this kind of combination of starting out with certain kind of idea elements, but then because you can't freeform it, forcing it into a template to then create something that may or may not be worth looking at.
So I asked you this the other day when we were having coffee. What do you hope your viewers feel when they look at your images?
Well, I hope they like. I hope they feel pleasure. You know, it's always nice to have people stop to want to look at what you do. So I guess that's the first thing. I mean, you know, part of especially playing with abstract art and my interest in abstract art actually goes back to my childhood when as a free-range kid in Chicago, one of the places that I used to go to was the Art Institute, and I was always taken by abstract art, and that's kind of carried through to what I've been doing over the years. So one of the realities of abstract art, to get back from that diversion, one of the realities to abstract art is that people see in it what they bring to it. So hopefully people will look at these and kind of see different things with it. One of the things that I like to achieve, especially because in order to do this, I need a really high resolution camera. So there's a lot of detail if you look really closely. And I'm a firm believer that you look at art close up, you look at it middle distant, you look at it from a further distant, you keep moving around. To me, the most interesting art is art that keeps changing as you change your perspective to it or as you change your distance, and it changes those scale effects. But other than that, I mean, I don't know, what do people see? Actually, I showed you Arch Fantasy, one of the fans that I did. I was showing some people in Japan, and they looked at Arch Fantasy, which was a picture inside the cathedral mosque in Cordoba in Spain. So it's archways, you know, it's my fascination with architecture. But these Japanese people I was showing my pictures to looked at it and said, ohashi, which is chopsticks. They saw the ribs and the array of ribs as chopsticks.
Oh,
so I really have to chuckle at that one. People bring all kinds of stuff to it. You know, when you look at them, you know, you see different things. You know, you begin to focus on a different shape. It changes, and hopefully I've done something that keeps changing for everybody, or changes even for an individual as they look at it in different ways.
Yeah, thank you. That's good. Maybe we should ask the audience.
Yeah.
Yes,
Dave.
go ahead.
So you start with photography, and then you get into basically geometry, various kinds of geometry and shapes and forms, and triangles and all this kind of stuff. And then just a few minutes ago, you said, and it's really important to have a very high resolution camera. Now, are these, once you've got this in the screen, can you just print it?
Well, the thing.
Where did you threw me when you get back to the camera, because I thought these were like created.
No, you need a high resolution camera for the pictures that you take, because the essence of this is if you think about it, I'm taking that triangle that you saw and moving it around and flipping it around and flipping it around and starting to match up an edge. Well, the more detail you have in the camera, in the photo that you're working with, the easier it is to match up all these little elements in the edges. And also what you're doing, I mean, one, I'm taking a full frame photograph, and okay, in my case, it's a 47 megapixel image, so there's lots of little dots there. Well, I'm taking only a part of that. So I need the ability to kind of scale that up and down that still maintains detail. Otherwise, if you have really low resolution, either by making it too big, you're going to lose detail, or by making it too small, you're going to lose detail. It's just the nature. I mean, like, as you shrink something down, it actually makes it a lot sharper, except to the point that you're taking all of those pixels, how many, you know, these little square picture elements that you have, where you squeeze it down to a certain point that they all start mushing together, and then you've lost detail again. So if you don't have a lot of detail to begin with, they're not going to look like much. As much as I have tried to go back to some of my much older photos, my earlier digital cameras just don't have enough resolution. It turns out that for a while, when I was still using film, I didn't switch to digital until 74, I guess it was. No, it couldn't have been 74. Sorry, but I'm trying to think. I lose track of time. Age does that to you. I guess it was 90, no. Maybe it was 2000, anyways, 2004, I think it was. But at the time when I switched, I used to shoot film, but I would digitize the film. Well, the advantage to digitizing the film is that I'm able to get a whole lot of information. Although, I mean, it's so fine-grained that it's crazy. I could give you examples of what kind of resolution you get by using film and then scanning it with a halfway decent scanner. But that I could use some of my photos, like, you know, pre-digital, but there was like some of my first digital cameras I really can't use because there's just not enough detail in the photo to be able to successfully match the edges. That's kind of the, I didn't mean to get too technical, but that's kind of the surface of it.
Okay, color me really dense, but I still don't get it. All these things, you showed us how you did triangles and circles and all that stuff on a computer. Then you, are these photographs?
Yeah. Yes.
But why can't you just take what you created in the computer, like in Photoshop, and print it?
That's what these are. So
where does the camera come in? That's what I don't
well,
know.
the camera comes in because I'm not a painter. If I sat there with a pencil or a brush or a pen or something and did what, and you know, look on the walls. We have a lot of incredibly skilled painters here. I'm looking at one right now with Eileen Mayhew. But you know, I'm not a painter. If I tried to even do a building or something like that, it would be excruciating for me because I don't have the exact, I've never been trained to do that eye-hand coordination. If you said, oh, do this building, but if you put me in a drafting board, I could do it, but that's very rigid. So me, without the skills of a painter, without like what Escher could do, I start out with a photograph. That's the medium that I could capture something with. And then from there, it's just these, I don't know whether you, I don't want to use weird because we're just on bad connotations all of a sudden. But you know, with I usually call them crazy, but somebody says stop using crazy. But to me, it's just like I get this crazy idea. So I take something from a photo and just start, you know, imagine, you know, you taking something and start crumpling it up or something, and then opening up and cutting it up and gluing it back together or something like that. That's kind of what I do, really, except I need to start from a photograph. You know, I manipulate the pixels a lot, but I still start out with that photograph, which is the given, and that establishes the proportions and things like that that get built into the constructions.
We have a question in the back.
Yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to make a comment.
Yeah.
Because, Vivian, your question is how do you want people to feel when you look at these works? And to me, Howard, they're so spatial. And I know you have this love of architecture. And it comes through even when the subject is, I think those are chrysanthemums, the pink flowers. To me, it's kind of almost cinematic. You could move through those spaces. You know, coming in close and going out far, like you're saying. And when you're talking about what you do next, you mentioned briefly looking at 3D. I feel like that's where you're headed.
Yeah.
And maybe even something cinematic. I mean, something with motion. But to me, they're so compelling in that they suck you in. You want to move around through them. And some of them more so than others, but I love that you can even do it with a flower. You know, even when it's not something orthogonal or drawn from a building.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, I mean, the interesting, and that's sort of what all of a sudden, I mean, I really felt like this, a certain sense of liberation by beginning to see how I could take what I was looking at in that, what those different stimuli that I had from seeing Escher, and then kind of revisualizing it in the ways that I've chosen to do it, because there is a lot of that. There's this, and Vivian, when we were having coffee to talk about how this was going to play out this evening, she used the sense of looking into these universes, that in a sense it's creating a universe, and in a way, you know, the movement from you know, straight 2D plane geometry to spherical geometry was really with us looking further and further out into the worlds, because there are all kinds of crazy shapes out there. You know, I mean, even the ones based on, you know, what you have with the great circle and stuff like that, that's only the beginning. I mean, it gets really complex from there. So there are all kinds of ways of representing it. And yeah, I mean, it's, one is that I could keep playing with these for a while, you know, with even just minor changes to the template by just constantly using different patterns, because, you know, different patterns create different things. So there's, right now I'm not feeling as much of that kind of impediment that I felt when I first, you know, realized that those ideas like Beatrice held don't just spring out. They're not always obvious. You know, when I ran into the reflections, that same limitation that I mentioned there, the same limitation of just playing in a 2D world. So this is a little more free from that regard. And yeah, I mean, it's that sense of space that I think gives it that, yeah. Yeah, I think you're right, Katie.
Someone else in the back, oh, here, and in the back. Yes, go ahead.
Me?
Yeah,
Oh,
I know.
I was going to say that, you know, like before when you were taking a lot of straight photographs, I thought they were really good. You know, like technically you have a great eye and your images were interesting and, you know, again, like really well, you know, printed and all of that. But I see this as, you know, more related to painting in a sense, in that you're adding the play part. You know, it's not the photograph, you know, you get everything sort of tightened up and, you know, and then you present it. Where this is, you know, you get this image and you're like, you know, taking something and adding what I would call play. Because we can really only lose ourselves in play. You know, other things really require a different kind of focus. And once you figured out the system, you got to play. And I think that's very much like painting. I mean, people always say to me, do you plan your compositions? And I say, no, because if I've already got it done in my head, I don't really want to do it again. You know, I really want to play, and I want to have that, almost like that struggle to figure it out and to get lost in it, you know. And sometimes it's not successful, but the time is never really lost, I think, in a way, because that's part of the process of losing, the reality of life, and just like, give it everything in a tight package and get it all sent out,
Yeah, another word that you probably heard a lot of while I was talking was not being boring.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the things, because I don't want to do the same thing over. There is a value for all of us, at least, it was advice, somebody who I talked to about art, and he gives me a lot of practical advice. And he said, and he's also, he has a particular interest in photography, but he's a painter. But in any event, one day he said to me, he said, you really need, you should have an identifiable style. People should be able to walk into something where your work is and go, oh, that's a Howard, and there's the value to that. But I have this other side of my personality, which is just like you say, play. I mean, it's just like experiment. It's, what about this? Explore. It's, there's a lot of sort of synonyms that you could use that kind of capture that same attitude. And so it's kind of like, well, how do you do something that's kind of identifiable and yet still allows you to change the way you want to change? Because, like I said, I'm exploring now. I have an idea that I want to change. I'm not exactly sure how I want to change, but hopefully, I don't know, it might be like 2017. It might be just like a flip-flop to something that is almost, where people start scratching their heads for a few examples and then begin to say, oh, Howard's into that now. Yeah, but I mean, what's wrong? I mean, art is, we should, as artists, we want to explore. We want to kind of, we're, even as photographers, and there are a number of photographers here, I mean, even as photographers, we're trying to show a way of looking at something that may be a little different from what people would expect. I can't find the exact quote. I should have written it down, but somebody who said, when you take a photograph, it should be at least as good as, if not better than what you were looking at. The print should be. So, I don't try to be representational by any means. I've always been abstract.
Was there someone else in the back? Yeah.
Yeah, go.
I just had a question on a little technical question.
Sure.
When you take the triangular slices, do you duplicate them, or are they all unique?
For a given piece, it's the same triangle, duplicated, 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 duplicated. So it's basically the same. Like I said, what I showed you with those lights and trying to use the different, that was one of the first pieces that I ever did that actually had multiples of what was attempting to create multiples of a slice, only with different, a different color palette on each slice. But yeah, basically, I don't know if I could come up with some way, I'm still exploring. I mean, the one with the lights was one attempt. I might try some others, but the whole trick is you have to be able to match the edges. If you can't match the edges, then you have to sort of fudge it, like either with the bands that Escher did to kind of help with the symmetry, or what I did with that lotus mandala to fudge the fact that I couldn't match the edges.
Someone in the back used the word compelling, that they are compelling. And it's interesting to me because I thought of them as universes because they were rounds, and but they're rounds, you know, without capitalism. They're sort of the earth, one might say, a globe, right? But it doesn't have capitalism, it doesn't have race, it doesn't have gender, it doesn't seem to have what we think of as, you know, the natural world. And I recently found out that Howard has a PhD in sociology, and I started to wonder whether this is the artist's creation of a perfect world, in a way. That was my association. Now, I would like to ask you, do you have any associations with any of these up here? Are there any of these up here that you feel particularly drawn to, let's say? Yes, Eileen.
The thing that hit me about them was that the patterns remind me of Iranian patterns that you see in mosques and around their culture. Did that have an influence on you?
In this case, not specifically anything in the, I mean, Persian and the Islamic world play with patterns because you're not supposed to represent people. So you don't do portraits. So, you know, clearly there's an appreciation of things like, you know, the tessellating, fancy word for tiling, you know, where you take shapes that you could interrelate like in a kaleidoscope, things like that. So there are all these influences that come together. I don't necessarily see them. I mean, we talked about this having coffee. I don't necessarily see kind of a philosophical orientation to this, except maybe philosophies that might, you know, sort of depend on a certain level of spontaneity. But, you know, beyond that, no, I don't think of these in that profoundly. It's really more kind of taking a photo that I look at that I like, that says, oh, this has some potential for this kind of pattern, and then kind of playing with it, and then kind of seeing, well, okay, is it interesting? It's more kind of, the meanings are in the visual experience rather than in something that I think I've embedded in it. I only did one piece when, you know, when George Floyd was murdered, and that upset me a lot, and I was playing actually with fans and sort of mandalas and the polygons and things like that, and I kind of stopped. I took something, one of two pieces that didn't start it as an original photo of mine. I just found a, you know, black nationalism flag and created a mandala that has been, I don't know if it's been here, I think it's been here, but you know, that spoke to me about Black Lives Matter. But other than that, I mean, these really are, for better or for worse, sort of devoid of politics as far as I'm concerned. If you asked me, I couldn't tell you what it was.
It seems to me like
as a political statement, they're not there.
They kind of reflect your life experiences,
well,
in my opinion.
Yeah.
I don't know. I mean, yeah, I sort of.
Symbolically.
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of the experiences that help define what you like looking at visually, I guess, is kind of the way that I respond to that. Yeah, Duff?
Yeah. Well,
Oh,
I see each of these as an individual. And it's hard to say, I like that one better than this one, I mean, each of them are a result of that process that you have devised, and they are representative of that process. And without that, they wouldn't exist. So when I look at them, that's what I start to think about, and that's where I find interest in each of them. I mean, they're attractive, but then backing out of it and saying, well, where did these come from? That's really, I think, a most interesting part.
That's really interesting.
Yeah.
To see them as a whole and to see the, you know, the technique, or, you know, what would it take to perfect this time and time again, you know, but in different ways.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
you could probably almost throw anything into the hopper there. I mean, I know, not really, but, you know,
Yeah.
something tells me that it might be possible.
Mhm.
Once you have that process defined, you could throw anything in there and come up with
something.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Worth, you know.
At least the glance, yeah.
Yeah, I don't want to discard your artistry at all, but I'm just, you
Yeah.
know, that's an interesting point, I think.
Yeah, I mean, some things work better than others, and
Yeah.
I think you're perfectly correct. Sorry, I didn't mean to pass you.
No, it's okay. So to me, the one behind you, because I'm an illustrator, reminds me of a very intricate African mask with either 4 eyes, little eyes in the mouth, or 2 bigger eyes in the center with a little mouth. And the one behind you, because the colors, and some of it looks like bees to me and honey. It looks like bees making honey. But that's just me.
No.
Everybody has something.
No, actually, I hear variations of stuff like that about all of the pieces, and actually, I mean, it's interesting you said this one with bees. I'll give you, I'll be totally honest. As that one was going together, I was really concerned that people would look at it and see these flying bugs. Because I don't know, that was like one of the responses I had, and so I was kind of like, does it look too much like bugs? But it's kind of interesting. Yeah, I mean, people see masks in them, people see, you know, there's all kinds of different reactions to it. You know, there is a certain amount of similarity at times based on the fact that it's still the same template, although there's actually 2 templates represented here, but they're basically by the same template. And the other thing is that, you know, when I take pictures, especially like the architectural ones, you know, you look at things and you say, wow, that's just like, or sometimes the really funny thing is, we'll go someplace, you know, one year, and a couple years later, we'll go back to the place. I'll be walking around with a camera or something like that, and I'll take some pictures, and I'll compare, you know, the first year with the later year. It's like, wow, I took the same picture again. You know? So, you know, there's certain things that emerge, but there's also that element of playing with it so that you see some different things or maybe evoke something a little different. One of the things by playing with the geometry from triangles is that you change things by spinning around which corner hits what. And I've kind of learned to be more conscious about that, because some of the earlier ones, if they were worth looking at, were accidental. Now I'm getting a little more conscious even about that, to try to, you know, create patterns. But it's interesting, most of the time, only one of the 3 potential orientations really looks good. Sometimes the rest of them just look like, you know, you can tell it's the same triangle, but it's just, they don't work. I don't know why.
So your wife has built off of that, saying that there's actually a lot of the natural world in your images when you look closely. And when I told my partner Christian that I was coming to listen to you talk about your art, he says, "Oh yeah, the math photographer." And that's funny to me because I remember when I was in the 8th grade. My middle school math teacher rolled in the TV on the cart with the belt around it, and he put in this ancient VHS about fractals. And the images in that VHS were very similar to some of the images that you create, and it was all about sort of the math underlying the natural world, and when we really get to things on a cellular level, the way that they repeat, like the Fibonacci sequence repeats in patterns that might up close look very much like what you create.
Yeah.
And the question about the bees reminded me of this.
Yeah, and I mean, like this, you know, you could see like beats in it and stuff like that just because of the scale of what it is, as they're represented in the actual print. And I mean, the only thing, yeah, it's sort of mathematical. I don't try to be excessively mathematical. I mean, if a real mathematician, and I could show them, and they would pull me apart in a second. It's more trying to do it enough to make it look okay, or look interesting, or look, you know, the way I constantly say, the end product is the way I wanted it to look. I'm not restricted by, you know, trying to represent a reality in a photograph. I'm not restricted by trying to make the most accurate colors that I can or anything. It's how I want it to look, which, is Eileen still here? I don't know if she left, but Eileen, is what Eileen Collins said, it's playing, you know. I'm so lucky I get to play, you know, 5, 6, 7 hours a day.
Howard, did you ever play with a spirograph?
Yes. I mean, that, you know, that's another one of these things. It's all of these fun little things that, you know, kind of grow out of these variations. I mean, that's a very, in fact, there's one in the basement, our basement. I know where it is. But yeah, you know, that's just based on a way of doing 2D plane geometric constructions. In fact, you know, when I took geometry, that's how I got into, you know, there would be examples of these crazy geometric constructions in the book, and I said to the teacher, I said, wow, those are really cool. And he said, oh, you could do those, you know, all you need is a straight edge and some triangles. You do need French curves to be really good, but stuff, I mean, so, you know, I bought some, went out and bought some, you know, compass and some straight edges and stuff like that, and started like, okay, I look at one in the book and I start playing with it. So, you know, this is sort of an extension of my childhood playing with creating shapes.
Would it be possible to challenge symmetry? To do something where they're not symmetric? They're still in the circle.
Yeah. I don't know. I mean, that's going to be an issue. My sort of very, you know, maybe about 10-minute look at trying to play with spherical polygons creates a lot of asymmetries. And in fact, if I was really accurate, and my original template, the very first template I did, and mostly the second until I changed that a little bit, really forced me to do the whole circle. But if you can imagine, it was so time consuming, it was like, shoot me. You know, it's just like, the first one I ever tried took more than 10 weeks. I mean, it was really, really hard. And, you know, I was concerned people would look at it and go, like, if I draw this line across here, it's not, these points don't match up, even though, you know, stuff like that. And that's when I kind of finally sort of said, well, if I deal with a quadrant and then end up, playing from the quadrant, I could at least build in one level of symmetry to it. But, but asymmetry is another aspect of art because, I think the West is hung up with symmetry maybe more than other cultures necessarily are. So it would be fun to try to play with asymmetries.
Is there anything you want to end with?
Any other comments, questions?
Good hair.
I'm just saying, I'm thinking about what you said. I'm looking at those now and say, well, okay, this is the circle. What if you took that circle and started to, pull it, stretch it? I don't know. You'd come up with a lot of different kinds of things.
Well, if I can find a way of translating the finished image from Photoshop that I could take. Photoshop kind of had some 3D elements to it, and then they kind of, how the corporations think, Adobe said, wait a second, we could create an entirely separate product, and then you'd have to subscribe to 2 products and stuff. And also, there's practice, I shouldn't be cynical, because there's reasons why certain software does certain things better than it does other things. But if I could kind of translate that into another 3D, then, or to something where I could really manipulate the wireframe, then, oh my God, I couldn't begin to tell you.
You could probably map those onto a 3D form.
Yeah.
Then, I don't know.
Yeah, well, one of the things, it wasn't super evident from the video, although the little promo that Katie did for this showed me working and showed a little bit of what I was doing with that. I'm actually sitting there. What happens is, when I take that duplicate of a triangle, the tool that helps me get it to really match the edges is like, imagine you're playing with a kind of a funny stretchy fabric, and you take that and you could do whatever with it. Well, in this case, what it's doing is it's allowing me, it kind of creates this little mesh network. The tool is called Puppet Work, and it creates this little mesh over it, and then you put pins at points so that you can move stuff around. But what's happening is that the program takes where you've put the pins and does these readjustments. It'll stretch it, it'll contract it, and kind of it messes around with it. Now, some of that's beyond my control. What I've discovered is that actually there are ways so if something doesn't look exactly the way I want it to I can actually mess around with it a lot more than you would think. But it's just kind of playing with the idea of pins. So if I could translate it into any kind of wireframe, yeah, then, the universe is the limit because it's 3D space, magnified tremendously. I don't know. Yeah, it's fun. There are a lot of degrees of freedom in this. I mean, it's less restricting so far than anything of any of the other iterations that I've run across. But I guess, thank you very much. I really appreciate it. I hope I haven't bored you.
No, there's an hour.
Thank you so much for coming.
Hey, good to see you.
Yeah, good to see you. Well, thanks.
Well, they'll be saying things like this was Howard's discussion period and this was Howard's
3D period.
Yeah.
Depends on the